Snapback showdown. The United States reimposes nuclear sanctions on Iran, but all other permanent members of the UN Security Council, including close allies, are rejecting the action. So will this help Iran strengthen its case? And is Donald Trump's strategy of maximum pressure against Tehran achieving its goals? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Hala Mahieddine. It's a measure that threatens to leave the US more isolated and raise international tensions. The Trump administration has brought back sanctions on Iran, and it's threatening consequences against those who violate them. Russia is calling the action reckless, and close European allies are saying that Washington has no right to reimpose any penalties since the US withdrew from the 2015 nuclear deal. Well, America's top diplomat has dismissed the agreement, calling it silly. The snapback sanctions that Mike Pompeo has announced mean the 13-year-old conventional arms embargo on Iran will no longer expire on October 18th. UN member states will have to comply with a ban on Iran enriching uranium and activities related to reprocessing, and implement the prohibition on Iran testing and developing ballistic missiles, as well as abiding by sanctions on the transfer of nuclear and missile-related technologies to Iran, among other states. Mike Pompeo says additional measures against Iran are on their way, and those violating it will face consequences. Well, hours after the sanctions came into effect, the UN's nuclear watchdog has said Iran has complied with demands for access to sensitive sites. The International Atomic Energy Agency says it has been able to win back cooperation from Iran and will continue to inspect its nuclear facilities. Well, let's bring in our guests. From Nutley, New Jersey is Stephen Rogers, a member of Donald J. Trump for President Advisory Board. Joining us from Tehran, Mustafa Hoshem, an Iran affairs analyst. And in London, Maya Lester, international sanctions lawyer at the Brick Court Chambers. Thank you all for joining us on this episode. Let's start over in the US. Stephen Rogers, the United Nations has announced snapback sanctions, but the rest of the world appears to be ignoring America. Given this, do you feel that this maximum pressure strategy is working? Because the only country that appears to be isolated at the moment is America.
Well, it is working. Keep in mind that the President of the United States, from the day he began to run for office back in 2016, made it clear to the American people that every policy that he set forth, whether it be domestic or foreign, would be in the best interest of American national security. So here in the United States, it has not impacted at all on him negatively. Now, with regard to what's happening around the world, it's working. Iran's currency is nosediving. And frankly, the people in Iran, they're fed up with their government. They want to see their government become part of the policies that are going to bring peace to the Mideast and around the world, and not war. So they're working. To be frank with you, they are working.
But what's the end game here? Because how exactly has implementing these sanctions changed Iran's behaviour? People may be unhappy in Iran, but they've been unhappy in Iran for a long time, and they mostly seem to be unhappy with America. America finds itself internationally isolated. That may be a good political point for the president in the run-up to the election, but certainly, if you look at the international perspective, these actions appear to be having the opposite effect.
Well, I would suggest that that's not fact. The President of the United States just made a magnificent historical agreement between the UAE, Israel, and Bahrain. I believe that the world leaders are in favor of that. They support that. The isolation is really not against the United States. Iran is isolated. We don't see people running to the borders of Iran saying, look, we're going to help you through this storm that we're facing. It's the complete opposite. The leaders may be verbalizing somewhat discontent with America, but at the end of the day, if you look at our history, they all come running back to the United States,
okay,
and they partner with the United States.
I see. So let me put that point to you, Mustafa Hashim. Iran can perhaps claim the moral high ground here with this latest episode, but in practical terms, this could count as a hollow victory because tighter sanctions are looming and what allies Tehran has left are being forced to pick sides. And as Stephen Rogers says, when push comes to shove, are allies going to side with America, who's more powerful, or Iran?
Well, hello, thanks for having me. As a matter of fact, it's no denial, there is no denial that the sanctions have made it life difficult for average Iranians, for me, myself, and many other citizens. But this does not mean that the United States has made a major breakthrough or has been successful with regard to its maximum pressure policy. The maximum pressure policy is a formula that was started under Obama. And Obama, Richard Nephew, who was the architect of the whole sanctions regime, especially against Iran, they have all stressed on several occasions that it would work for no more than 2 years, since the end game is bringing Iran to the negotiating table. Well, the 2-year-long period ended in May, several months ago, and Iran's GDP shows that it has earned positive GDP in the last 3-4 months, despite the very fact that the whole world has been experiencing a negative GDP or GMP because of the coronavirus. Iran is experiencing an improvement right now. Iranian oil officials vowed yesterday that in coming months, Iran's oil exports will improve and the conditions will improve. Well, as a matter of fact, we could see on the global scene that 13 UN Security Council members are standing against the United States interpretation. As you just rightly pointed out, this is the U.S. that has been isolated. And even John Bolton, who is a comrade of Donald Trump, actually, and who's a hawk, he even acknowledged a few months ago that the U.S. maximum pressure policy failed in May because they could not cause a collapse of Iran. Neither they could push Tehran to surrender, and they failed to subdue Tehran. Tehran is still standing, and it still insists on the same similar road.
I'm sorry to cut you off there, and John Bolton may be coming round to realising this maximum pressure isn't working. As I said before, Iran has the moral high ground, but life is difficult. How much longer is Iran prepared to sit and wait this out?
Well, as I just mentioned, Iran is now moving towards, a better economy because the data shows that Iran is improving right now, despite the very fact that coronavirus situation and the consequent economic impact has, life more difficult. But these are the numbers that are speaking. And despite the very fact that the Donald Trump administration meant to cause public protests in Iran, we just saw that in the last 1.5 years, 1 year, this never happened after the last unrest that was more than 1 year ago. And it was very limited in size. So Iranians have come to realize something that's very important. That's what some experts in the U.S. were really afraid of, because Donald Trump played this formula of Obama, this containment policy through sanctions and threats, very naively and in an inexperienced way. They pushed Iran towards surgeries in economy that Iran was afraid of doing so for several decades.
Okay.
Even under Shah, they were afraid of cutting dependence on oil. Now, Tehran has been forced to cut dependence on oil totally. So the situation is going to improve when they start selling more oil in future, as they have cut off all dependence on oil.
Okay, let's turn to you now, Maya Lester. These snapback sanctions, they are being legally disputed, but I mean, as we've touched upon, there is a practical element to all of this. It doesn't matter who's technically right or who's on the right side of the law here. The US is more powerful, and when push comes to shove, the Europeans are likely eventually to side with the Americans. Is that a fair assessment?
I don't think that is a fair assessment. So the European perspective on this is very much, this is exactly why we negotiated a nuclear deal. So the purpose of the nuclear deal negotiated in 2015 was precisely to deal with issues like, is Iran complying? Is Iran sticking to levels of enrichment contemplated under the deal? And are the other parties sticking to the deal? There is a dispute resolution mechanism under that deal, which both Iran and the E3, that's the UK, Germany, and France, have triggered. And their perspective is, let's deal with this in the context of the deal that we negotiated. Now, when President Trump, who famously called this the worst deal ever negotiated, decided to pull the US out of the deal in 2018 and reimpose the US sanctions that had been lifted, he said that the US is no longer participating in the deal. What the US is now doing, at least according to the permanent members and the EU, is trying to have its cake and eat it. Having said we're pulling out and reimposing very powerful US sanctions, what they're now trying to do is say to the United Nations, we think that UN sanctions should be snapped back because Iran is not complying. And the perspective of the EU and indeed the other UN permanent members is you can't do both. You can't say we're not in the deal mechanism, but we want UN sanctions to snap back. So that's where the legal dispute lies. Meanwhile, what the US has done is said, fine, forget this legal dispute, but we will act ourselves in the US as if sanctions have been reimposed. And we will say that we will impose our very powerful worldwide US sanctions, nothing to do with the United Nations, if we think that people are breaching sanctions on Iran. So what the US is doing is using its own legal powers, which are very powerful in the world because of worldwide reliance on the US dollar. But that's the dynamic. There is a big difference between what the US is able to do itself and what the US can do as part of the international community.
Well, it seems, Maya Lester, that the US is abandoning the international community and going it here alone. They're wielding these powerful sanctions. Do you think the EU is prepared to be sanctioned if it continues to engage with Iran?
Well, it'll be very interesting to see what happens, but the EU has absolutely consistently, the EU that facilitated the whole negotiation of the deal, the EU has consistently worked to uphold the deal, to try to bring the US back into the fold. When the US hasn't done so, it's tried a few things to try to shore up the deal, to try to make sure it's stuck to. So it has tried to block, to some extent, the effect of US sanctions. It's tried to facilitate lawful trade with Iran. But it's also really important to stress that the EU has itself expressed concern about Iranian perceived non-compliance with the deal. So the EU is not simply saying, we fully support everything that Iran does in this field and not the US. The EU has a much more nuanced position, which is we are still working within the terms of the deal. It deals perfectly with a dispute resolution mechanism, and we are not going to go it alone like the US has done. So at the moment, it seems that the EU is sticking very closely to that position of shoring up the deal.
Stephen Rogers, let me turn to you. The Trump administration seems determined to implement these sanctions. It seems determined to go it alone, to use its powerful sanctions to bring Iran into line. If the Europeans and the Chinese and the Russians are continuing to try and work with Iran, is the Trump administration at this point prepared to sanction countries like France, Germany, and the United Kingdom?
Well, I don't believe, and I hope it won't come to that. I believe that France and Germany and other nations that are very close to the United States will sit down with President Trump and will discuss this issue and hopefully support the position of the United States. Any leader of any country will be looking out for the best interests of their people, their national security. And therein lies the platform on which President Trump has consistently stood on. He's looking out for the best interest of the American people. That is his job. They will look out for the best interest of their people, and hopefully President Trump will be able to negotiate with them and bring them on board.
It doesn't
But I
sound
must
like
tell
much of
you,
a negotiation, though, if you're saying that they're wanting France, Germany, the UK to agree with America and adopt its position.
well, it's either
My
side
way or
with
the highway.
the United. Well, not. You know, I'll tell you what. Maybe not. But I believe that at the end of the day, do you side with a nation that has a history of financing, exporting terrorism, a nation that has not added any value to peace in the Mideast, or you decide with a nation that is looking for not only the best interest of its own people, which is America, but the best interest of people in the Mideast? President Trump has demonstrated recently that he has made significant moves to bring peace to that region. And we all know that. No one can deny that. So the question is, who are you going to side with? Either you side with the United States or you side with Iran. And they're going to have to make that decision moving forward.
Okay.
I believe historically they're going to side with the United States.
Maya, you were trying to respond to that.
So just to make things clear here, I don't think it's going to be a question of the US sort of imposing sanctions on France, Germany, the EU. But what the US has already been doing for many years, and I think will now certainly continue to do so, is it imposes sanctions on those that it sees as pursuing unlawful trade with Iran. And those sanctions are on non-US persons. So the US already says anyone, anywhere in the world, and that certainly includes the European Union, that engages in sanctionable conduct in US terms will be cut off from US financial markets. Now, that is a very powerful tool. But when people talk about the US sanctioning its allies, what it's really doing is saying, if you don't play by our rules, you will be subject to being potentially cut off from our own dollar system.
Well, then,
so what is happening now is nothing new. It's simply more of the same. It's more exercise of US unilateral power without the international community being behind it. It's worth also saying that the position of the United Kingdom is slightly nuanced and interesting here, because Boris Johnson and the Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, have both expressed a bit more of consideration to changing the nuclear deal in some way. It's not clear what they're considering, but it could be that the UK has more sympathy with the President Trump position, that there are problems with the deal. But certainly no one at the moment in the EU is taking the view that the deal should simply be torn up. And I think the controversy at the moment is that the US has said very publicly, we do not want to participate in this deal anymore. But it's now coming along and saying, actually, when it suits us, we want to act like a participant.
Mustafa, let me get your view on this. At this point, do you feel that this JCPOA deal is worth saving? Because the US is working unilaterally. European allies are starting to have concerns and have had concerns for quite some time about Iran's compliance and conduct. Why is Iran still adhering to this deal at all if it's falling apart so spectacularly?
Well, let's remember that the Europeans, they've been in support of the deal only through their political positions and in words and not in action, despite the very fact that they made promises after the U.S. discarded the deal to cooperate with Iran under the deal in 11 areas of economic cooperation. They never did anything in support of the deal and to give Iran the economic merits that have been vowed under the deal. But let's remember that the UN Security Council members' opposition to the U.S. resort to the trigger mechanism meant that the whole world has come to realize that Iran cannot be subdued or shooed away or intimidated, but differences could be resolved through deals and negotiations. That's why everyone is trying to save the deal. But the point here is that the U.S. is working unilaterally. It's making a mockery of the UN Security Council, actually, and the mechanism, because if it were another country like Iran, Vietnam, Iraq, or anyone else, the UN Security Council would start immediately to punish that country as soon as it violated Resolution 2231. That was a decision of the UN Security Council members altogether. So the U.S. is undermining, the mechanism of the Security Council, and if it becomes, a role model for others, then other members would also go for the same approach whenever they don't like a decision of the Security Council, and there will be chaos. So the UN security should rush to rescue not only the JCPOA, but also its own, sovereignty and its own rule.
Well, people have been arguing this for not just on the Iranian issue, but the Syrian issue and all sorts of things. You could argue that the UN Security Council has been undermined and powerless for quite some time now. My question to you is this deal worth saving, given the US is going it alone and given there are so many challenges to it?
Now, I'm coming to your question. Here is the word. The UN Security Council, for the sake of its own rules and regulations, they should support their decision. The decision was the nuclear deal.
On Iran specifically, we only have 3 minutes left. We only have 3 minutes left.
Okay.
On Iran specifically.
Let me rush to the conclusion. First of all, they should start doing deals with Iran. The only merit left for Tehran is the removal of arms trade ban that is going to be removed actually on October the 18th. So they should stand up for their own, 2231, the resolution, and start deals with Iran. That's the only, removal of the arms sanctions is the only merit left for Tehran. If Iran doesn't see that merit also comes true, then it would give up the nuclear deal. It will be requested by the public. There are many that are requesting the government to discard the nuclear deal. Second, they should rush to stop the U.S. from escalating the situation through exercising the contents of earlier resolutions so illegally, because it includes inspection of Iranian cargo ships and planes, and Tehran would not hesitate to defend its ships and cargoes and its interests.
Okay.
Therefore, there would be escalating tensions and war if the UN Security Council does not stop the U.S. from violating international rules and regulation and its own Resolution 2231.
Okay, final question to all of you now, because we are almost out of time. Stephen Rogers, how do you see this ending?
After President Trump is reelected in a month or so, Iran will come to its senses and they will join the world in trying to solve this problem in the Mideast.
Okay, Mustafa Koshem, how do you see this ending?
Well, I just made my point. If Donald Trump comes to office, I do believe that JCPOA would be dead because he would not allow Iran to receive the merit. Then we would be witnessing more and more tension, escalation, and war, definitely. It's not Iran when Donald Trump said he would arrive at a deal with Iran in less than a month if he is reelected. Actually, he meant that he would change his strategy towards Iran if he is reelected, because he has already experienced the failure and defeat of his maximum pressure policy.
Okay. And Maya, the final thought to you. Do you think that the outcome of this rests largely on whether President Trump is re-elected, or is there still any hope at all of saving this agreement?
I think that obviously the US elections are very important, but I think if President Trump is re-elected, we will simply see more of the same, which is not, in my view, the deal being torn up, and it's not, in my view, the UN Security Council being undermined. The US's attempts to undermine the Security Council and have UN sanctions reimposed have not been successful. The UN has ignored it and said this is too legally ambiguous, we're going to continue with the status quo. Biden has certainly said that he is more keen to turn back to the deal. But I don't think whoever is elected, we've seen the last of the nuclear deal by any means.
OK, so a note of hope there to end on, certainly if you're in favour of the JCPOA. As ever, these things all appear to hinge on what happens on the US presidential election. A fascinating discussion from all three of our guests. I'd like to thank you all now. Thank you to Stephen Rogers, Mustafa Koshem, and thank you also to Maya Lester. And I'd like to thank you too for watching. Remember, you can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And you can get further discussion from our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story, or tweet me directly @Hala Mohideen. But for now, from me and the whole team, bye-bye.